Hello. Today I wanted to talk about automation. So basically, we're in Path of Exile right now. I'm just going to do some delve while I talk about this. So hopefully I don't get too distracted, but basically the goal of the conversation is to talk about how automation can change the way games are played, if not the way, the industry of gaming or healthcare or anything really can be affected. So the whole point is that, right now, like, you see these minions and these monsters, and you see my player character, right? And so, like, these all have inputs that are right now controlled by where my player character is, right? And in addition, there's also this aspect of automation that is just done hands-free, right? So if I stand in place, you can see that my minions have their own quote-unquote AI, right? So they have their own way to trigger how they work in the world, regardless of my player character. Although there are aspects that are, associated with the player character, as I just said. But the thing is, right, is that these quote-unquote AIs, they're like a profile, right? So the zombies have a profile, and that profile can be specifically changed, right? So there's a modifier within the game, right? Minions from supported skills are defensive, and I have this on my raised zombie and skeletons, right? And so if there's this modifier that changes the profile of how the AI works for the zombies and skeletons, right? The other alternative is offensive, and then I think there's also just the normal one, which is different than defensive and offensive. I'm not too sure, but it serves its purpose just to explain that there's different profiles for the AI. And so the profile for the defensive one is that the zombies and the skeletons will stay close near me, right? And so what we're trying to go through and talk about is if we have this automation right now, the developers of the game, Grinding Gear Games, right, they had to list this profile of defensive, offensive, etc. and so forth, right? And so when they list that, what I mean by that is they're coding it, right? And so you have this profile for the AI, for the allies, like the skeletons and the zombies, and then there's this other AI that's for the monsters, right? the bosses, etc. And this isn't necessarily changed, these profiles for the monsters and the bosses. It isn't necessarily changed by having a modifier like on a skill gem like you saw there, or a support gem, where it said defensive. And so the different profiles, what they're good for is that you'll have these ways to make the game seem more or less predictable. Let's just put it that way, right? So when you have these AI profiles for things like allies and enemies, this is a form of automation, right? And so the game is designed in such a way where the profiles have been developed, and then for the most part those profiles are left alone after development, and people just play the game and have their unique experiences where, you know, one time they did a boss fight and the boss used this move set, or another time they did the boss fight and it did another move set. And so it adds to replayability and, you know, making the game feel alive, right? And so automation is very important, AI is very important, but then the bigger extent to which this is important is that if you think of things like, in the case of like healthcare, if you think about like diagnosing a patient, you know, AI is being used right now to have the ability to understand before a patient has developed cancer, what are the signs and symptoms that they may be on that track of being somebody with cancer, right? And so there's profiles of the patient and of the doctor that need to get developed in an AI in order for things to work, right? And so, you know, typically these AIs in healthcare are not developing, oh, the doctor is going to have, you know, a different age or a different education. It's mostly like the patient is going to have a different age and a different education, right? And so same thing goes with video games, right? In Path of Exile, there's no real development in terms of like, well, is this player character going to have a profile where the player can be played by some AI, right? Because most of the time you would assume a video game, right? The player would be playing. Why would they ever take a break, for example? You know, shout out to Left 4 Dead with their navigational meshes, I'm pretty sure, which would allow, you know, in co-op split screen, a player to take a break and have their character model go on like a navigational mesh or path that was also in coordination with the alternative of following the other player that didn't take a break, right? So the AI for a player character profile I wouldn't say should have
Don't step on the cracks.
you know, this follow this nav mesh, this navigational mesh, follow this path in order to complete the level, right? Or just follow this other person in your party, for example, and do, you know, what activities they're doing. That shouldn't be how the game plays itself, but that's typically how you will have these games be played at the level of automation for things in, you know, Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter, Left 4 Dead, you know, things like, you know, anytime there's player on player or player versus monster, perhaps, not all the time though, you could have the potential for, like, the AI to play the player character's side of things, right? And so, same thing with healthcare, right? You have these doctors that don't really have their profiles, and so, you know, you're missing out on automating a large portion of what makes the game, in the case of a video game, or makes the prediction of cancer in real life that much more knowable, right? Or that much more intricate. Because here's the thing, right? You have a game environment, right? And so this is why I'm kind of talking about the two together, because right now, you know, AI is being developed for, like I said, predicting cancer, right? And so the thing is, though, is like, there's no environment for the development to happen of, like, this doctor profile, because it doesn't make sense to these people with the AI resources to develop, oh, well, what if the doctor had this level of education or was this age? It makes much more sense to factor in the patient's level of education and age. And so really the patient side is just developed. Similarly, in video games, just the enemy or ally AI is developed and not the player character AI. Right? So there's no profile for doctor or for player character. But what I'm trying to say is imagine a world in which we have this player or this game or this diagnosis of cancer that can happen at a level that is, you know, automated, right? And so what you would want is you would want to have the profiles developed for the doctor and the profile developed for the player character in the case of a video game. And you would want an environment to develop this in for the case of healthcare. And so, you know, it's an interesting conversation is like, well, what exactly would you do to make a environment? And what I mean by environment, right, is if we think about a simple game like checkers, the environment is the board, and the profile is how you play, what moveset you use when you play checkers, right? And so what I mean by the board, right, the environment, that's like the rules of the pieces have to stay on the board, on the squares or whatever, and, you know, rules like that, right? That's the environment. And so you would need to develop an environment like, let's say, a hypothetical body where these cancer, healthy cells, fat cells, every type of cell inside the body where you're trying to diagnose the cancer, that would be your environment, right? In the case of a video game, you already have the environment, you already have the enemy and ally AI, but what you're lacking in is the player character AI. And once that gets automated, you can have a fully automated game, all right? And what that leads to is then you can have fully automated profile development, right? So remember what I said in the case of the video game, the profile had been developed by the developers. In the case of healthcare, the patient profile is essentially, it could either be AI determined, but it's usually pre-sorted by some human to say, well, this is somebody who develops cancer, someone who doesn't develop cancer, that sort of thing, right? And so what you would want is, of course, you would want the profiles to define themselves, right? And so what you need to do that is you need an initial profile for the player character. You need an initial profile for the doctor. And once this is developed, in the case of healthcare, right, what you're doing is you're saying, well, I have this profile of the patient, and I'm going to basically play doctor and just tell the AI what is and isn't cancer, right? And then what you need to do is you need to say, well, I'm going to play patient and tell the doctor what is and isn't a person who could have cancer, right? And so you're developing both sides. And then once the profile has been in totality developed for the patient and in totality developed for the doctor, right? And in totality just meaning you have some extensive profile to determine, you know, different educations for the doctor, you know, wherever you can get the data, right? And what the algorithm is doing, what the AI is doing, is it's taking these variables you've given it and it's trying to have the goal of predicting cancer, right? And so when you go from patient profile to doctor profile, what you're doing is you're trying to make a doctor and patient profile that is very good when the doctor is controlled or when the patient is controlled to be able to predict cancer. And then when you put them against each other, another algorithm or AI would combatively have the doctor profile and the patient profile be created inside the environment that you've made, right? So that the profile can be ultimately refined and made in terms of variables that you didn't define or develop for either the doctor or the patient, right? Just what you've given within the environment. And so to translate that in terms of Path of Exile, right, you have this understanding of, well, here's the environment where, for example, right, so I'm in the hideout and I have this water here, but there's a wall, there's an invisible wall, and so I try to walk into the wall and I stop, right? And so this environment has a rule that says there will be a wall here. And when you develop a video game, you know every single rule that exists in terms of everything that's coded, you know what it is. And so the profile of the player character can be combated against the developer profile. And so what does that mean, right? At first, you hold the developer constant and you just try to develop a player character profile. And what that means is that you want, if I generally want the player character to play the game itself through AI, the profile needs to have things like, well, if I have one less zombie, summon a zombie, right? And so there are certain rules you would set up in this profile, just like the way that the enemy and ally profiles are created. And then once you kind of have a general idea of a player character profile, you start to develop a developer profile, right? So given this environment that we're in, what happens if I make the rule that there's no wall here? What if I make the rule you can only summon 8 zombies? And so you can start to see now, right, that in the case of a video game, you can go from this environment which has all these rules that you know all the inputs and outputs of. All you need to automate is the player character with some baseline profile, and then scale that profile up with enough dedication to designing rules that help this player character AI move around like an ally or enemy does. And once this is developed, you can further refine the player profile with having the AI recognize okay, so I'm gonna hold constant these variables, the 9 zombies, the wall here, and I'm just gonna make the player profile AI move this way, move this way, move this way, move this way. Oh, it hit a wall. Okay, so now I have to move this way because the goal of this environment would be to try and, let's just say, get a divine orb, right? And so you would be having the environment replicate all these scenarios where the player would move a couple steps. Oh, it didn't get the divine orb. Restart the test, right? Move a couple steps. It goes through Act 1, right? Still doesn't have a divine, restarts, right? Until it gets to the point where it gets a divine. And then that's the player profile that you use to then automate development. Okay, and now this is what I was saying. This is where it gets applicative to like a real world. This is like next level, right? Because most AI that's being developed right now is being developed one-sidedly, like with just the patient stuff, not really considering doctor data. And even the ones that do consider doctor data, right? It's not like they're combating the doctor and the patient with data that isn't readily available, right? So they can't rely on generative data. They have to rely on data that's been provided. But the hope is that you would develop an environment like a video game environment, not where you're playing patient or playing doctor, right? But where the environment is the body. Okay? And so once the doctor's profile is developed and the patient profile is developed, then you start to change, well, what happens if we put these two profiles against each other? Okay, we got the best, most optimal way to predict cancer given the environment we had. All right, so now let's try to put the patient versus the development of the environment. Okay, now the development of the environment versus the doctor. Okay, and then you go and you combine doctor, patient, environment, body, right? And now you have this whole set of operations you can perform where AI is optimally determining a goal that you set for it to do. All right, and so it's easier to get there in terms of development from a video game because they already have the environment. So let's just think about this for a second, right? You have this player character profile. You know, the first question you're going to get is, well, can I have a player character profile that does exactly what I want it to? You know? And so what it would be about is it would be about trying to have some initial developed player profile that includes basically every single rule of what could possibly happen for the player character. Walking, attacking, using all the skills, all that stuff, right? And so this profile would be able to do everything in the game, from crafting to all that stuff, right? So it's a very development-intensive process, right? But if you get that down, what you have is you have a character profile for the player that can be customized by any player. So imagine, right, once you have this profile, you allow somebody to essentially have their own profile, right? So what you do is you say, like, in this map, your player profile is going to be created. And so every action that the player does, from attacking, movement, flask usage, all that stuff is recorded. And generally, there will be some player specific profile that was developed. And so now you can have every single player have their own profile. And so now when the game plays itself, you know, you click take a break on Path of Exile, and it uses your player profile and starts playing the game as if how you would play the game on your character based on the test that you took. Alright, and then what you have is a story experience where you're watching a movie on the screen, but how you would play the game. In addition, once you have a player profile developed, you run that against the environment, holding development constant, and you can see all the areas you need to develop. So for instance, right, if you see that, you know, the witch is getting to Act 10 in like 3 hours, but the marauder is getting there in 2 hours. Okay, so how should you change in terms of development? Well, if you just run it against the developer profile, now you can balance the game. So that's how things can advance very quickly, is you have an environment, you have a player character profile, and then eventually you can include a developer profile and also individual players' profiles, so the game plays itself but also according to how they would play it, and then things take off from there. And so the reason why I mentioned this whole healthcare thing is because, you know, this could be something that is applicable, that starts with video games, that ends with every other industry, you know? Because this idea of the environment is only being utilized in video games and for enemy and ally AI. It hasn't been fully utilized by developers because of the immense amount of work that goes into making a player character profile where the game will 100% play itself. Alright, so automation is just AI or algorithms that are used to develop profiles through combative, you know, the player does something, then the environment does something, then the player does something, then the environment does something, and it's a battle between the two to see which one is going to happen. Get the divine orb or not get the divine orb, be able to get out of the encounter, not get out of the encounter, that sort of stuff, right? And so you would just need these profiles from the algorithms after they've been hashed out to a certain extent already by the developers. An environment like a video game where you know every single input and output. See, that's the major advantage, is that the developers have access to this environment where they can see the digital component of what this text comprises of in terms of numbers that then can be interpreted by a computer, so that the algorithm knows how exactly to move on the terrain to do certain specific functions efficiently, etc., and so forth, right? And so it's interesting stuff, but the whole thing is this conversation leads to a lot of other conversations. If you can have player characters that are automated, and then balance the game, and then offer players their own profile within the game, you can just think about it from there. And then as far as healthcare goes, there's no perfect environment like you have in a video game. So it's all going to be estimates on how the body would work this way or that way. But it's a starting point that can only get better, and the first step towards that direction would be a video game that is fully automated.